If someone gave you this newborn infant with its extraordinary potential and said you had 20 years to develop it into this person lying unconscious on the sidewalk, overlooked by a world that's frightened of such things, what would you have to do to accomplish that? The answer to that question has enormous significance in terms of the practice of medicine, in terms of the economy of a nation, in terms of social malfunctioning, problems in public health, problems that we all face every day as citizens. So the A study is what we learned about exploring the origins of these problems and how we came to see that oftentimes the perceived problem is also someone's attempted solution to problems that we know nothing about. The implications of this paradox are major for prevention and for treatment, and so too has been the resistance to using this information clinically. I will start by summarizing what we learned in the A study and then show you the evidence for it. We found that 10 categories of adverse childhood experience are remarkably common and very disturbing, and hence are mostly unrecognized. They turn out to be powerful predictors of adult social malfunction, health risks, biomedical disease, and premature death. And that integrating these findings into primary care medical practice appears to produce a major reduction in medical care costs, but surprisingly has been resisted. So let me show you the evidence behind those statements. In a way, the A study began with this woman who showed up at an obesity program that we were running. She came in 1985 and asked us if we could help her with her problem. Our first mistake was that we accepted her diagnosis of what the problem was, and we said yes. And we reduced her weight from 185 kilograms to 60 kilograms in 51 weeks. This is an extraordinary thing that can be accomplished now, not surgically, but by a technique called supplemented absolute fasting. And so here she is at age 28, here she is at 29. And we thought, well, my God, we've got this problem licked. She taught us in short order that we had no idea what we were doing, but merely were in possession of a powerful technology. Years later, we found this picture of her at age 8. It really forces one to ask, well, what happened between here? And indeed, in the treatment of obesity, inquiring the age at which weight gain first began is the #1 most important starting point. Her weight gain began at 11. Why not 4? Why not age 33? Age of onset is a key point. Here is a weight curve. It looks like an Olympic ski jump. 185 to 60 kilos. Then, in one 3-week period, she regained 37 pounds, which I had not believed was physiologically possible before she did that. And I remember asking her what was going on. And she said she thought she was sleep eating. What do you mean? Well, when I was a kid, I used to be a sleepwalker, she said. I haven't done that for years, but I live alone. And when I go to bed at night, everything is clean and put away in the kitchen. I wake up in the morning, boxes and cans are open, pots and dishes are dirty. Somebody's obviously been cooking and eating there. I'm the only person there. I guess that's what's happening, but I have no recollection of it. Okay, has a certain force of logic to it, but why now? Why now? And pursuing the why now led to her answer that the sleep eating began the day that she was sexually propositioned at work by a much older man, as she described him. He was married. Okay, but I mean, this is 1986. It is Southern California. It's kind of an extreme response, even if it's a pretty gross proposition. Why the extreme response? And pursuing that led to a lengthy incest history with her grandfather from age 11 to age 21. That lowered my threshold for thinking about childhood sexual abuse, and soon we started inquiring routinely about that in the obesity program. It was very confusing because it seemed that every other person, man or woman, that I was asking was acknowledging such a history. And I remember thinking, it can't be true. People would know if this were true. Somebody would have told me. Wasn't that what medical school was for? It took a number of months to convince me that what we were uncovering so freely was real, but nobody wanted to hear about it. We began with sexual abuse, then other forms of heavy-duty physical abuse, major emotional abuse, other forms of major household dysfunction, etc. So here is this woman. Some years later, what you see here, I should point out, is that she is back over 180 kilos, 185 kilos faster than she lost the weight. And she disappeared for 12 years. She came back still safely over 185 kilos and had bariatric surgery. At a point where she had lost only 96 pounds, that's about 40 kilos roughly, which was not clearly visible. The volumetric reduction was not sufficient to be obvious yet. She became intractably suicidal and had 5 psychiatric hospitalizations in 1 year and required 3 courses of electroshock to gain control of the situation. So here she explains why this happened and how what we commonly view in public health as the problem may be viewed by the patient as an unconsciously attempted solution to problems that we know nothing about. Mistaking somebody's solution for their problem is a serious mistake that we commonly make. It's really what makes preventive medicine and public health so difficult. Listen to what she has to say.
I wasn't really handling the weight loss too well. I mean, it came off too quick, and I just felt like I was losing my protective wall. It was like, you were right, there was no going back. I wasn't able to use food as my way to get fat again, to have my solution back. It's like I had lost my solution, and I was having a hard time trying to find other solutions to deal with the underlying issues of the obesity versus just using the obesity as my wall.
It was she who triggered us in an adult obesity program to start looking routinely for childhood experiences as the underlying causality for what was happening decades later. Ultimately, the significance of this became so obvious and so major that it forced the question, is this at all prevalent in a general population? And if so, how does it play out over time? And that was really the purpose of the ACE study, was what we were discovering about childhood abuse of various forms at all common in a general population, and how did it play out over the years? The design of the ACE study is depicted here. We had a very unusual department of preventive medicine that provided unusually comprehensive medical evaluation to 58,000 adults a year in one setting. It was the largest operation of its type in the Western world, probably anywhere. And so we designed slowly, took a couple of years' work to figure out how we were going to do all of this, a study involving 26,000 consecutive adults coming through this medical evaluation program, asking them if they would help us understand how life experiences in childhood might affect adult health and well-being. 70% agreed. So we had a study group of 17,500 adults, almost exactly half women, half men, 80% white, 10% black, 10% Asian. 74% had been to college. This was clearly a middle-class group. And so we matched current health status here, determined by very detailed medical evaluation, and compared it to 10 categories in the first 10 categories of adverse life experience in the first 18 years of life, so roughly a half a century earlier. And then we have followed these people for the next 20 years, matching what happened here 50, 60, 70 years ago against current pharmacy costs, emergency room visits, doctor office visits, hospitalization, and death. I should tell you that when we proposed this study to the institutional review board, all medical research in the United States has to go through an institutional review board, basically to make sure that nobody brings up the Nazi medical experiments again. This was started after the Nuremberg trials at World War II. It got turned down by the institutional review board. Otherwise, sensible people said to us, you know, you can't use that questionnaire. you're going to cause patients to decompensate by asking them those questions. We battled 9 months with them to get agreement. Finally, they agreed on the condition that one of us would carry a cell phone 24 hours a day for 3 years to take emergency calls from people that we were going to make jump off the San Diego bridge. We never got one call. Instead, I have a notebook of letters, largely from elderly women, one of whom wrote, "Thank you for asking. I feared I would die and no one would ever know what had happened." The 10 categories that we studied are these. Major emotional abuse, basically recurrent humiliation. You are the stupidest kid I've ever seen. I was talking with a man a couple of months ago who told me that when he was a little boy, his father used to line the kids up and tell them, "You kids ought to just be taken outside and shot." Acknowledged by 11% of this clearly middle-class group. Major physical abuse, I don't mean spanking, I'm talking serious beating with fists and sticks and so forth, 28%. Contact sexual abuse. Contact sexual abuse, not somebody flashing a kid, acknowledged by 28% of the women and 16% of the men, 22% average for the group. Incredible. But who would know other than by routinely asking? And we have all been effectively taught as little children that nice people don't talk about certain things, and my God, certainly don't ask about them. Major emotional neglect, 15%. Major physical neglect, 10%. Growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was an alcoholic or a drug user, 27%. Losing a biological parent before the age of 18 for any reason, 23%. That was interesting, because what we saw ultimately was that the least damaging way of losing a parent was by death, unless that death was a suicide, because death at least offered the possibility of creating a protective mythology. My mother would have cared for me if, my father would have protected me if. Most destructive was maternal abandonment. Mom split when we were 3 and we never saw her again. You know, you think if an animal in the woods loses its mother, it's going to be dead by the end of the day. Growing up in a home where one of the members of your household was chronically depressed, mentally ill, etc., 17%. Where mother was treated violently, 13%, where one of the members of your household was imprisoned during your childhood or adolescence, 5%. At every turn, we were stumbling into something totally unexpected. We also learned that if you're going to get this information, it is best to get it initially by using an inert mechanism rather than face-to-face, a well-devised, lengthy questionnaire filled out at home. When you have that information ahead of time, then you have the advantage of knowing where you need to go further, where you don't need to go further, and it's a lot easier to get that information. We'll come back to that in a moment. We were dealing with mountains of information. We literally had over 400,000 pages of information in the A study, medical history questionnaires, physical exam forms, laboratory results, etc. We needed a way of simplifying things. And so we created an ACE score, which was the sum of the number of categories, not events, but categories. And what you see here is that 1/3 of the people claimed none of the categories. 2/3 of them claimed at least one or more of the categories, up to 10. 1 in 9 people claimed 5 or more of the categories. That if any category was present, there was an 87% chance that at least one other category would be present, and a 50% chance that 3 or more categories would be present. And we found that women were 50% more likely than men to have an ACE score of 5 or higher. But what does this look like in the office? Well, this is an interesting man. He's a quite bright man, in a way an amateur psychopharmacologist, equally, in a way, a semi-professional saloon fighter. In a different era, he might have been a cowboy. Today, he might be someone working on an oil rig out in the ocean. But whatever, a line of work that keeps him safely far from home. The background story here is that when he was 3, his parents divorced, and he never saw his father again. Mother remarried when he was 5. For whatever reason, his stepfather saw fit to beat him pretty much every day. When he was 8, he remembers one day he's walking to school and the thought crosses his mind, nobody is ever going to be there for me in my life. When he's 20, he's imprisoned in Rhode Island for attempted murder. He comes home one day, finds his stepfather beating his mother, and takes a heavy iron frying pan and produces 5 long bone fractures and 1 skull fracture. Ultimately, he gets out of prison, becomes a good citizen, works on major construction projects that keep him away from home most of the time. He sends his paycheck home to his wife very responsibly. Listen to what he is also an alcoholic, a 3-pack-a-day smoker, and a heavy user of crystal meth, the street drug. Listen to what he has to say about the functional aspects of what we typically dismiss as dysfunctional behavior.
20 to 25 years drowning out some poor childhood experiences with drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. Got rid of the drugs, got rid of the alcohol. Next thing I got to get rid of is the cigarettes. And I had no idea that the nicotine played such an important part in keeping that door closed.
In keeping the door closed to?
The memories that I've blocked out with all these years with the alcohol and the drugs.
So you see what's happening to you now as related to what happened to you decades ago?
Yep. I found a way to block the emotions and the memories.
With?
Drugs, alcohol, cigarettes.
So he is talking about our 3 most common addictions. Addiction being the unconscious compulsive use of psychoactive materials or agents. Or in plain speak, it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. Maybe the next mouthful, or the next cigarette, or the next dose of what I'm buying on the street, or the next drink, or the next man or woman is going to do it. And if not, well, surely the one after that. What we found was that addiction is due to characteristics intrinsic in the the common belief is that addiction is due to characteristics intrinsic in the molecular structure of some substance. I used to believe that for many years. Common statement of that is if you take heroin enough times, supposedly you can't stop. What we found was exactly the opposite, that addiction highly correlates with characteristics intrinsic to that individual's childhood experiences. And the strength of this relationship is extraordinary. And its implications for treatment and for prevention are profound. A woman named Lee Robbins, in the closing years of the Vietnam War, carried out a very important experiment. She met with almost 1,000 American soldiers in Vietnam who acknowledged to her that they had used heroin daily for at least the prior 30 days. Acknowledged to her, not to the Army. When they were discharged and sent back home, she met with each of them 8 months later. 8 months later, 94% of them were no longer using heroin. Zero treatment. A real eye-opener. The animal version of this experiment was carried out by a man named Bruce Alexander, a very imaginative psychologist in British Columbia, in what has become known as the rat park experiment. He had a nice air-conditioned rat room. Every rat had their own cage and so forth, three meals a day, clean water. Can't beat it. And he gave each rat in their cage a bottle of water and a bottle of water with heroin. And the rats all chose the water with heroin. Dr. Alexander was imaginative enough to realize that this very comfortable rat room, air conditioning and so forth, was highly stressful on the animals because they each had their individual cage with solid walls. They never saw another rat. So he took those rats who were addicted and put them into a big enclosure outside, an enclosure with dirt and rocks and garbage and trash thrown into it, rat park, as he called it, and gave them the same choice, water or water with heroin. And overwhelmingly, they chose water. This is a very interesting insight. So here's what we learned when we looked at smoking. I don't know what it's like here, but it's very difficult to smoke comfortably in most of the United States. In San Diego, you cannot smoke on a public beach, you cannot smoke in a county park, etc. So when we looked at people who were smoking in this hostile environment to smoking, we saw something interesting, that the higher the ACE score, now we're looking, roughly a half a century back, the greater the likelihood of there being a smoker in an environment notably hostile to it. Well, this doesn't fit in with the conventional belief, that people smoke because they passed a billboard for cigarettes on the way to school as children. But the man you just saw speaks forcefully about the antidepressant, anti-anxiety, and anger suppressant benefits of nicotine. And those benefits occur within 15 or 20 seconds of inhalation. The risks are major. They're 15 or 20 years downstream. So the world medical literature documents these immediate benefits extensively, but we've comfortably forgotten them in our public health onslaught against smoking. And maybe that's why there has been no net decrease in smoking in the United States in the past 13 years. We're looking at only half of the equation. The risks are very real, but far in the future. The benefits are immediate with inhalation. We looked at self-acknowledged alcoholism. Sit down, have a drink, relax. Well, some people need a lot of relaxing. This is self-acknowledged alcoholism, not our diagnosis. This is the patient's diagnosis. And what you see is that as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of being a self-acknowledged alcoholic goes up rather dramatically. Once again, the benefits are essentially immediate. The risks, which are very real, are way out in the future. We looked at injection drug use, street drugs. This is even stronger. As the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of being an IV drug user goes up dramatically. But what I don't show here is that at ACE score 6, it is so wildly off the scale that it doesn't fit on without essentially compressing the rest of it. At ACE score 6 or higher, the likelihood of that individual becoming an injection drug user is 4,600% greater than the likelihood of an ACE score 0 individual. And I remember the epidemiologists at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, telling me that numbers of that magnitude they see once in a career. You know, you see the latest cancer scare of the week, something increases breast or prostate cancer by 30%, and everyone goes nuts. And here we're looking at 4,600%. Now, in America, the most common street drug is methamphetamine, crystal meth. I don't know if that's popular here. Everybody knows, you know, bad stuff, you can die from it, and so on. No one seems to remember that the first successful prescription antidepressant introduced for sale in the United States in 1940 by Burroughs Wellcome and Company was methamphetamine. So does it mean anything that the most commonly sold street drug in America is an acknowledged potent antidepressant? Methamphetamine led was the most prevalent antidepressant medication in use from 1940 until the late 1950s when tricyclic antidepressants came out. But isn't it dangerous? Yes, but no more so than taking 30 aspirin tablets at once. No more so than tripling your digitalis dose. You know, you'd be dead in a week from doing that. So the issue of unknown concentration, unknown purity, no knowledge of proper dosing, and so forth, matters crucially. Does this matter to our treatment of any of the addictions? Do you think we should focus on the underlying problem, or do we continue providing empty advice, vacuous advice that what's being done is bad? Let me fix the example in your mind. This is a full-page photograph from the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1943, an advertisement for the highly successful new antidepressant methamphetamine, the stuff in impure form and unknown dose that is sold as crystal meth. So ultimately, we came to see that there was this public health paradox, that many of our most common and intractable public health problems are unconsciously attempted solutions to personal experiences that occurred in childhood but have been lost in time and then further protected by shame and by secrecy and by social taboos against exploring certain topics. I mean, nice people don't talk about certain things. We've all been taught that as children, allowing monstrous problems to remain comfortably unrecognized. There's an analogy here to smoke and house fires. When a house is burning down, the most obvious symptom is the smoke that's billowing out. And we can be thankful to our fire departments that they understand that the most obvious symptom is not what needs to be treated. Otherwise, they'd bring large fans to blow the smoke away. And soon homeowners would flee the treatment because it makes the house burn down faster. Just like Our successful weight loss patients were the ones who were dropping out before we figured out what was really going on in this complex issue. Just like there are high rates of dropout in most addiction programs. In our obesity program, we do not teach people how to eat right. We help them discover what life experiences are being treated by overeating or by being protectively obese, and we help them work on those. Here's the sister of the original patient. She too is over 180 kilos. Well, my God, 2 women in the same family, over 180, obesity runs in the family, it must be genetic. But the interesting thing about that family is that everybody spoke English in that household. That is to say, speaking English ran in the family, and we don't jump to the conclusion that therefore speaking English must be genetic. Actually, both were thin until their grandfather and his son started molesting them. So listen to what she has to say, because she illustrates the sequential relationship of adverse childhood experiences to depression, then to overeating and obesity, then to diabetes, then to disability, and finally to the social welfare system. In another patient, foster care and prison might be along the way.
What's the heaviest you've ever been in your life?
In excess of 400.
So the same as your sister Patty?
Yes.
Uh-huh. And how and why did you get so fat?
Well, I was abused sexually by my uncle. And once again, I used food as a comfort. I didn't have much of a childhood because I started working when I was 13. Then I got married at 17 to get away.
How old were you when your parents got divorced?
I recall I was 9.
Did you ever see your father again?
No.
How do you think being abandoned by him affected you in the rest of your life?
It affected me a lot, especially with the growing up years, because like there was father-daughter dances and dinners, and I'd have to take an uncle, and things like this. Everybody else would talk about their fathers, and mine wasn't around, and it was devastating when my mom and dad broke up. I remember it very distinctly.
Here's a woman who was heavily molested by her father as a child. She treated that with 3-pack-a-day smoking, which kept her thin, until her husband decided to convince her to stop smoking when she was 35. And she explained to me that smoking 3 packs a day keeps people at a certain distance. And so when she stopped smoking, she was very frightened by a great deal of male sexual attention that she had no experience dealing with. And she ate to ease her anxiety and quickly gained to 310 pounds and had to go on 24-hour-a-day oxygen because what had been subclinical in terms of lung damage now was brought to the forefront. So she's on 24-hour-a-day oxygen, weighs over 300 pounds, and some years later comes into the obesity program and loses 150 pounds and no longer needs the oxygen. And we thought, well, my God, wonderful, isn't this a great success? However, what we conceived as success threatened her enormously because the unwanted male sexual attention came back, and she consciously decided to regain the weight and accept the use of 24-hour-a-day oxygen the rest of her life. You you supplied me recently a lengthy autobiography, a number of dozens of pages altogether. And on the very next to the last line, you said something that I thought was extraordinary. Let me read it to you because I think it's remarkable. I believe smoking 3 packs a day and weighing 300 pounds are not the problem. They're the symptom. Took us a long time to figure that out here, and you just casually dropped that as though, of course, anyone knows that. So you are in respiratory failure on 24-hour-a-day oxygen.
Yes.
Major amounts of weight, overweight.
Yes.
And you demonstrated, or we demonstrated together a couple of years ago, that when you had a major weight loss in the OptiFast program here, that your need for oxygen disappeared.
That's correct.
So that, if you lost 150 pounds approximately, the need for oxygen would no longer be there. The weight came back. Most people have very little understanding of why people get fat or regain. I mean, they're stuck with this simple belief, don't you know it's bad for you, etc. And people tend to know even less about smoking.
Yes.
It's labeled an addiction, and as though that somehow explains it all.
Right.
Etc. And you make this extraordinary statement about what we perceive as the problem really being the solution. Can you explain more about that?
Yes. I think I've come to that conclusion. It hasn't been quite immediate. It's come to me over the last few years of analyzing just exactly where I've been and what I've done. Obviously, I was a 3-pack-a-day smoker when I was thin. I didn't have a weight problem until after I was 35. But I've done several OptiFast type things, and I finally came to the realization on my own that the reason I put the weight back on was to protect myself.
Moments later, she starts speaking of her chronic depression. Most people speak of depression as a disease. Many say it's genetic. Some say it's due to chemical imbalances in the brain. There's something to be said for each of those. But what if depression were not a disease, but a normal response to abnormal life experiences? And here's the evidence for that. Looking at self-acknowledged chronic depression, women in red, men in yellow, you see as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of self-acknowledged chronic depression goes up rather dramatically. At ACE score 4 or higher, in women you have a prevalence of almost 60%, in men 35%. We looked at suicide as it relates to underlying ACE score. You see something rather dramatic here. As the ACE score goes up, marked increase in the likelihood of attempting suicide later in life. At ACE score 6, once again, we're wildly off the scale. At ACE score 6, there is between a 3,100% and a 5,000% increase in the likelihood of committing suicide as compared to ACE score 0. So these are really quite extraordinary. We looked at rape, which I once naively thought was fairly uncommon. And you see, as the underlying ACE score increases, the likelihood of being raped later in life goes up. Well, how does that work? What are the linking mechanisms? You'll have a chance to ask me some questions, but that's one I'd like you to think about. We looked at the making of madness, self-acknowledged hallucinations. And you see, as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood at ACE score 7 or higher of having hallucinatory activity is 10%. And because we felt that there would be people who were saying, yeah, but I mean, at A-score 7, people are going to be using street drugs or alcohol to try to feel better, and that's why they're hallucinating. So we corrected for that in the white bars, and you see essentially the same thing. So interesting, adverse childhood experiences and the relationship to a major marker for the making of madness. We looked at high-level promiscuity, which we defined as 50 or more lifetime sexual partners. As the A-score goes up, the likelihood goes up. This might be better titled Looking for Love. Maybe the next woman is the one who's going to love me, and if not, surely the one after that. And sometimes, when relating to one's peers is too threatening, that hope will be fulfilled by photographs, or a child, or even a farm animal. We looked at the relationship to domestic violence. Interesting, similar for men and women. We're used to thinking of women as the victims of domestic violence, but that's because their victims are typically their children, who are not in much of a position to make that known. We looked at how this plays out in the workplace. Relationship of underlying A-score to absenteeism, to self-acknowledged serious financial problems, to self-acknowledged serious problems performing my work properly. And in this last slide, A-score and its relationship to unintended pregnancy or elective abortion. And here we see that unintended pregnancy, usually treated as an accident, like most accidents, is not totally accidental, but interestingly, miscarriage of pregnancy turned out to be related to A-score, taking us into the biomedical area. How does that happen? How does what happens to a little kid affect the likelihood of miscarrying a pregnancy a decade or two later? This is a big idea moving us into the biomedical area. We'll look at liver disease, and when we saw these outcomes, we initially thought, well, sure, you're going to use street drugs to feel better, you're going to get hepatitis, and that's what's causing this. And that's certainly true, but it's only a little piece of what learned. So how else can you get liver disease? Keep the question in mind, because it ultimately reminded me, I don't know if you all are familiar with the American poet T.S. Eliot, but a statement of his, "In my beginning is my end." So we looked at heart disease. Now, pretty much everybody knows, since the Framingham study, that there are a number of high-level predictors for developing coronary artery disease: cholesterol levels, smoking, etc. Most people don't know that about 10 or 12% of people with coronary artery disease don't have any of the 13 recognized risk factors. So when we looked at them, people who had heart disease but none of the conventionally accepted risk factors, we saw something interesting, that each of the ACE factors had a measurable effect, worsening the likelihood of coronary artery disease. Well, how does that work? I mean, we're not talking now about smoking, to get relief, etc. We're talking about when those things are all taken away. Well, in recent years, it's become clear, and this is really quite recent, that chronic, major, unrelieved stress causes the release of pro-inflammatory chemicals, sometimes called pro-inflammatory cytokines. And those cause inflammation of the lining of blood vessels. In the very smallest blood vessels, capillaries and arterioles, those inflammatory changes of the lining cause the vessel to shut down completely, turning to scar tissue what a piece of organ it had been supplying. Our first patient, Patty, died at age 42 of an uncommon condition called primary pulmonary fibrosis. Her lungs turned to scar tissue. She was never a smoker, never had any exposure to air pollution. In recent years, again, it's become clear that some portion of cases of primary pulmonary fibrosis are related to the release of these pro-inflammatory chemicals. Oh, isn't that interesting? Then, in larger blood vessels, those inflammatory changes in the lining act like a magnet to attract cholesterol deposition, causing cholesterol plaques to build up inside the vessel, causing partial obstruction of the vessels. Now, the medication, the category of medication known as statins are well known for reducing cholesterol and reducing the risk of heart disease. They work very well, there's no question about that. What's interesting is that, again, in recent years, it has become clear that the main effect of statins is not lowering cholesterol. They do that, and that's beneficial. But the main effect of cholesterol that's now recognized is an anti-inflammatory effect. So that the anti-inflammatory effect prevents the magnetic attraction of cholesterol to deposit on the lining of these blood vessels. So this is really kind of an interesting thing. Cancer. Am I saying that what happens to a little kid can affect their likelihood of cancer? Now, we're not talking, that the treatment for what happens as a little kid is smoking 3 packs a day. That's too obvious. Here's a more subtle kind of thing. And this really has to do with the question of resilience that we'll come to in a moment. This woman whom you'll see is articulate, well-dressed. She holds a responsible position in a large university. She's obviously doing well, and is just the kind of person from whom we'd not seek an abusive childhood history. I mean, my God, she's doing fine. Leave those ugly questions of yours at home. Of course, we'd skip such a history for our own comfort, but we'd also be smart enough to say that we saw no need for upsetting a patient who's doing so well. So listen to what she has to say. It's really quite extraordinary. Her name,
just by looking at.
Her name, by the way, is up there at her request because she doesn't want what she has to say to be diminished by anonymity.
That I was an abused child. Can you tell that I was sexually abused routinely, that I was neglected, starved, beaten? Probably not. You would have to ask in order to find out, and that's not the sort of thing that people typically ask about. The downside of having this kind of childhood is that it translates into health problems in adulthood, at least in my situation it seems to have done. I'm now recovering from my 3rd battle with cancer. Not the same cancer, 3 different kinds of cancer. I've had chronic pelvic pain, migraines, the whole laundry list of medical complaints, all of those sorts of things that are very difficult for physicians to figure out. Growing up that way instills a constant fear, a constant state of turmoil that's just under the surface of a veneer that's fairly thin. little things become scary in an atmosphere like that. And once you've internalized all of that, it's very difficult to let go of it.
Having 3 different kinds of cancer is extremely uncommon. She is thoroughly convinced somehow that they are related to what happened to her as a little girl. A couple of decades ago, I'd have dismissed that as just craziness. In recent years, however, there's solid evidence that that's a real thing. So how do major emotional stresses cause cancer, other than by smoking 3 packs a day to feel better? Well, you all know that if a person gets an organ transplant, they have to be on lifetime immunosuppression so they don't reject the organ. Many of you will correctly have heard that one of the long-term side effects of lifetime immunosuppression is an increased risk of cancer. But sometime in the future, and if I'm going to die next week of kidney failure, and maybe I'll get cancer 20 years from now, fine, give me the kidney. The way that works is that we all are forming low levels of cancer cells every day, and our immune systems destroy them, and we never know the difference. Under conditions of major chronic unrelieved stress, one of the effects of this on a person's brain is by hyperstimulation of areas that suppress immune function. So we no longer have the ability to destroy the low level of cancer cells that are routinely formed in the background every day. Oh, isn't that interesting? In other words, getting cancer means either that the rate of production of malignant cells is increased so high for whatever reason that our immune systems no longer can handle their destruction, or our immune systems are so damaged or suppressed that they no longer can handle even the low level of background production of malignant cells. This is a real eye-opener. So the biomedical relevance of all of this turned out to be very heavy. Cancer, liver disease, autoimmune diseases. We looked at 21, and most of the 21 that we looked at had a clear relationship to ACE score. Heart disease, lung disease. I mentioned the primary pulmonary fibrosis before. So we saw that adverse childhood experiences determine the likelihood of the 10 most common causes of death in the United States. And the risk factors for the 10 most common causes of death in the United States are the things that we've been talking about up to now. We did not study imprisonment because we had a clearly middle-class population, but other people have, including some in Norway and Sweden, and they've sent me small studies of 100, 150, prisoners. And ACE scores are remarkably high amongst prisoners. The American psychologist James Garbarino has published a book recently called Listening to Killers. He has spent a good bit of his time interviewing inmates on death row. And the conclusion of the book is very clear, that murderers are made at home. In that vein, it is striking, in the United States at least, that in school shooters, the defect in the news articles is that nothing is ever mentioned about the parents who raised or didn't raise these individuals. What do you have to do if you have, say, 16 years to create a school shooter, to create a murderer? So let me summarize what we've been looking at now. We saw that with an ACE score of 4 or more, the majority of adults have multiple risk factors for these diseases underlying the 10 most common causes of death, or the diseases themselves, or have died already. And we have a paper out recently showing that at ACE score 6 or higher, there is a 19.7-year shortening of life expectancy, basically a 20-year loss of life expectancy. We saw that many chronic diseases of adults are determined decades earlier in childhood, not by childhood diseases as once was the case, but by life experiences. You know, this has been a profound change over the past century. You know, you think rheumatic fever, polio, diphtheria, rickets, pellagra are gone. And many people are not even, aware of how important they once were. I remember as a little kid, there was a poster nailed on the door of a house across the street. The health department had quarantined the house because of diphtheria. I mean, such a thing would be inconceivable today. So adult diseases now are commonly related not to childhood diseases, but to childhood experiences. And the risk factors underlying these adult diseases often are effective short-term coping devices. They help in the short term, are extremely damaging in the long term. This is an important insight into the origins of alcoholism, of drug use, smoking, obesity, promiscuity, violence. It's hard to give up an effective short-term coping device, particularly at the request of somebody who has no idea what's gone on before, that causes the need for these coping devices. Examples of coping behaviors: smoking, overeating and obesity, physical inactivity, withdrawal, promiscuity, teen pregnancy, suicide attempts, alcoholism, illicit drug use, repetition of the original trauma, self-injury like cutting, etc. So you've all seen how we all seek ways to cope with traumas, to reduce their pain. And it's important to remember that these are coping behaviors, because that will start you wondering, well, what is it that's being coped with? Maybe that's what needs to be treated, not the superficial manifestation. In other words, it's the fire that needs to be treated, not the smoke billowing out of the house. And I'll bring up this public health paradox again, that many of our most common and intractable public health problems are unconsciously attempted solutions to personal problems that occur in childhood, but are lost in time and then further concealed by shame and by secrecy and by social taboos against exploring certain areas of human behavior or experience. And as a result of us not talking about these things, monstrous problems remain comfortably unrecognized. So evidence from the ACE study ultimately ended up showing that adverse childhood experiences are the main cause of so-called health risk behaviors, of disease, disability, premature death, and healthcare costs. And the magnitude of this is enormous. The Framingham study was of great importance in showing us that there were predictive risk factors for many diseases: obesity for diabetes, smoking for lung cancer, cholesterol for heart disease. In the ACE study, we've seen the determinants of those risk factors and that many of those determinants took place in childhood. As I mentioned before, we have this publication showing that at ACE score 6 or higher, there's a shortening of life expectancy of almost 20 years. But why are these things so monstrously difficult to deal with, to treat? Here are PET scans of the brains of 2 3-year-old little boys. A PET scan is a very sophisticated kind of X-ray that depicts biochemical activity in color and superimposes it on anatomical structure. So this is a cross-section of the brain, PET scan, of a 3-year-old American kid, ordinary kid. And this is the PET scan of the brain of a 3-year-old little boy taken from a Romanian orphanage. You may remember that Romanian orphanages were noteworthy because of the extraordinary levels of neglect imposed on the inmates. And what you see is large areas of brain where there's no color, where there's no biochemical activity going on. And I don't think it's going to tax anyone's imagination too much to think that maybe at age 3, when brain is being formed, that lack of biochemical activity is going to affect the kind of brain that's being formed. In other words, we're looking at the translation of life experience into neuroanatomy, and maybe that's why it's so difficult. So we could summarize what we've been talking about in this way. You have this very large base of people with adverse childhood experiences, which are mainly unrecognized. We realize in recent years that this causes disruption of brain development very early in life, producing various kinds of impairment. Maybe this is the socially isolated kid, the weepy kid, the one who has trouble learning in school. By the time they become teenagers, they have enough freedom to try to do something to feel better. Smoking helps, sex helps, street drugs help, etc. Those things that help in the short term produce major long-term problems. So in middle age, disease, disability, social problems, many people die early, but the whole sequence is lost in time and then further protected by shame and secrecy. So if you were to ask, well, what could we do to make things better? How could we get from where we are to where we might be? Well, in my mind, 2 things would make a big difference. 1 would be recognizing that these problems exist, and 2 would be routinely recognizing them in medical practice. Here's where all of this took place on the top floor of this building. We've had some early but significant experience with integrating ACE study findings into medical practice. And the routine introduction of ACE study questions into the questionnaire of our comprehensive medical evaluation program turned out to have a major and profound effect on doctor office visits in the subsequent year. So as I said before, we began routinely including in our 10-page general medical history questionnaire trauma-oriented questions, the 10 in the ACE study, and some additional questions for related experiences. Well, many colleagues assured me that, yeah, you're crazy. You can't ask patients questions like that. My God, they'll be furious and no one will tell you the truth anyway, etc. Well, it turns out that routinely asking everyone matters a great deal. Not only that, but we've now done it in this one department with 440,000 middle-class adults over an 8-year period. And it's been remarkably acceptable to them. We added questions like, have you ever lived in a war zone? Have you ever been a combat soldier? Who in your family has committed suicide? A very different question from has. Who in your family has been murdered? a very practical question with large immigrant populations coming from some war-torn area of the earth. Who in your family has had a nervous breakdown? Were you ever molested as a child, ever been held prisoner, tortured, raped, etc.? So when patients come in, they bring in this 10-page questionnaire that they filled out at home, and we feed it into a digital scanner that picks up all of the yes answers and reorganizes them by body systems, and we end up with a 2, 3, sometimes 4-page laser printed output. And these are from a real patient. This is somebody who physically abused as a child, verbally abused as a child, molested as a child, has been threatened or abused as an adult by a sexual partner, etc., having serious problems with her family, serious problems with her job, has used street drugs, would like to be tested for AIDS, etc. So it takes a couple of minutes to look at this, but before you walk into the exam room to meet someone for the first time, you have an extraordinary depth and breadth of information about them. You know where you need to go further, and you know where you don't need to go further. And our most common approach with this information was, I see on the questionnaire that. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? I see on the questionnaire that you were the one who discovered your father's body when he hanged himself. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? I see on the questionnaire that you were molested as a kid. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? And we listened. Period. A couple of years into this, a German mathematician from the University of California comes by. And this guy had a startup data mining company that's now on the New York Stock Exchange, actually. And he offers as a gift to do a 130,000 patient study for me, 2.5 years throughput for the department, to see whether the addition of these questions has any relevance, any measurable effect. To my absolute amazement, what he found was that it was associated with a 35% reduction in doctor office visits and an 11% reduction in emergency room visits. And this is a 130,000 patient sample. The exact same medical evaluation, but without the trauma-oriented questions, led to an 11% reduction in doctor office visits. And we were very pleased and, assumed, well, that's probably because more comprehensive diagnosis, more efficient entry into complex medical care systems, etc. But this really forced us to think differently. Many people said that, seeing that, said to me, how'd you do that? You sent everyone to therapy, right? No, we essentially sent nobody. How'd you do that? We spent a lot of time thinking, how did we do that? And ultimately, I came to see the enormous power of routinely asking, listening, and the next piece, implicitly accepting. I've told somebody really important to me something deeply shameful, and they still seem to accept me as a person? Wow. Isn't that interesting? Now, the dollar value of this is huge. The outpatient budget for Southern California, Kaiser Permanente, is $6.5 billion a year. 35% of $6.5 billion is pretty serious money. In the 12 years since we discovered this, it has gone nowhere. People try to make me feel better by saying, well, it took a long time for the germ theory of disease to be accepted. Certainly so, but I'd like to see something happen while I'm still alive. So this routine use of an inert mechanism, a well-devised questionnaire filled out at home, and then picking up on that in the exam room. I see on the questionnaire that. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? Is a very powerful tool. I would urge you to experiment with it, whether you are working in a medical office, a hospital, prison, a mental hospital, etc. It's been an extraordinary experience. So, what we learned in terms of practice, the implications of the ACE study, that a biopsychosocial and trauma-oriented approach to comprehensive medical evaluation we demonstrated to be feasible, affordable, and acceptable to patients, that it's realistically possible to move from our current symptom-reactive mode of practice to start dealing with basic causes and thereby improve care while reducing its costs, and that a trauma-oriented comprehensive medical history has been demonstrated to have major benefits and is proposed as the routine entry mechanism into all ongoing care, medical, psychological, or institutional, including prisons. I'll close this way. We demonstrated that adverse childhood experiences are common, but typically unrecognized. Their link to major problems later in life is strong, proportionate, and makes sense. I mean, my God, even the patients can explain it if you give them a chance. That they are the nation's most basic public health problem. That it comforts us to mistake intermediary mechanism for basic cause. Oh, the reason all those kids are so fat is because there's a McDonald's in town. That's why it's happening. That what presents as the problem may be some patient's attempted solution to things that we know nothing about. And that treating their solution may be threatening and cause people to flee treatment. And that primary prevention, figuring out how to keep this from happening in the first place rather than trying to fix it after it happens, is presently the only feasible population approach. We don't know how to do that, but it's the right problem to focus on, and I have no doubt that well-intentioned people working on this will come up with some testable ideas in short order. And the change has been resisted by us in spite of enormous potential benefits. If you want to learn anything more about the ACE study, here are some sources of information.